So hello everyone, and thank you for joining this joint Young Statistician section and significance event. So the aim of the webinar today is to give a bit of background to the significance writing competition for those people that are interested, and also to provide some tips on making your statistical writing more accessible. And we're lucky enough to have two speakers from Significance magazine who are on the editorial board, Brian Tarran and Robert Matthews, and also two previous writing competition finalists, Jonathan Auerbach and Sam Tyner. We're going to open with a presentation from Brian giving an overview of the competition. Brian's been the editor of Significance for the last 4 years, and he is a journalist by training.
So this is the what, the why, and the how of the competition. The competition is one of my favourite parts of being editor of Significance magazine. It was one of the first things I did actually when I joined the society 4 years ago now, nearly. I'm always impressed by the range of entries that we get and the range of topics that our entrants choose to write about. So I wanted to start by talking a little bit about Significance. I'd hope most people would be familiar with the magazine already, whether as RSS members or as ASA members, or as statisticians in training. You might have encountered the magazine in the course of your studies or work. But Significance is a magazine. It's designed to be a showcase for statistics and the role it plays in life, in science, in commerce. And although the articles that we publish are broad and varied, I guess you could say they fall into three general categories, and that would be articles that sort of challenge established myths, articles that seek to answer questions, maybe they're difficult questions concerning public policy, and hopefully data can provide some evidence to challenge the way we think about those sorts of things, and also showing how statistics is used to support decision making in public life, in science, in business, wherever it might be. So the magazine is written primarily by statisticians and data scientists and anyone with an interest in the analysis and interpretation of data. We would try to write for a very broad audience. So although that you get the magazine as part of your membership of the RSS or the ASA, we want it to be a magazine that college or high school students can pick up, people working in industry who might use data but don't necessarily produce it or analyze it themselves, and who want to know more about it. And we also like to get it into the hands of journalists and other people who might be intrigued by the stories and might want to learn a bit more about the way statistics works and the way that statistics makes a difference in those areas of life that I previously described. But to reach a broad audience, we need people, statisticians, who are enthusiastic about their subject and can write and demonstrate that enthusiasm through their writing. But really, being able to tell a compelling story is key, because we're not publishing journal articles, we're publishing magazine articles, and being able to hook readers in and introduce them to an idea and take them on a journey essentially is a really important and key skill that we look for. So we're lucky enough to have a huge audience already of statisticians, and many of those demonstrate those skills and have sought us out and do write for us on an ongoing basis. But what we really wanted to do was try and find a way to encourage younger statisticians or early career statisticians to develop these skills, and hopefully for us to establish a career-long relationship with these people. So that was one of the reasons we launched the writing competition. It was announced in 2011, and the first winner followed in 2012. Excitedly, last year it became part of the RSS Statistical Excellence Awards program. So we renamed it the Statistical Excellence Award for Early Career Writing. So the award itself hasn't changed, but it gets a bit more prominence and certainly more promotion through the RSS network now that we're part of this program. So the basics haven't changed. The winning article is published in Significance each October. That's print and online, and then we also feature runners-up on the website. So what's in it for us? Obviously, we get a great piece of content from a talented young writer. That's really good. and Jonathan, who you'll hear from later, has written a couple of pieces for us now, and it's a relationship that we hope to develop as he goes on in his career. For you though, I think there's plenty to gain. If you win or are shortlisted, you will obviously get exposed to our international readership of professional statisticians. We've also had great success at promoting winning articles and authors to mainstream media. So again, Jonathan, when he published his article, it was picked up by newspapers and websites like the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Daily Mail, Newsweek, China Daily, Japan Times. There was real wall-to-wall coverage of that, which was exciting to see. And last year's winner, Kevin Lynn, you might have heard, was interviewed on the BBC's flagship statistics program, More or Less. So again, there's wider interest in the competition beyond the field of statistics. And then, the real selling point, I guess, for the competition is for young statisticians the chance to present at a special session at the Royal Statistical Society International Conference. This year it's in Cardiff in Wales, and that's I think it's a great opportunity for young statisticians to come along and talk to and meet a wide variety of delegates and interact, and hopefully it will help you develop your career going forward. So in terms of what we're looking for in the competition, all the details you'll see on that link below, significancemagazine.com/579. That's got all the rules. This is just a selection of them, but the main ones are that the article will need to be 1,500 to 2,500 words. It can be on any subject, but obviously we do ask that it involves statistics or statistical analysis. Otherwise, we'd be better off sending it into another writing competition. That's our USP. We want it to be an easy-to-read magazine-style feature. I made the point earlier that we're not looking for journal articles, so the journal structure that many of you might be familiar writing to doesn't apply to us. But it's not, there's nothing particularly secret about the way to write for a magazine. We all like reading magazines. We're all familiar with that style. It's just a case of picking it up and learning some of the structure that magazines adopt, and that's what Robert will talk about. He'll give you some hints and tips in that direction. And we also ask that it's an article that isn't under consideration for publication elsewhere. So we want it to be an original idea. That doesn't mean that you can't, if you might have published a journal paper or been a co-author on a journal paper, that doesn't mean you can't adapt what you've done or talk about the work that you've done in that journal paper. It just needs to be very different. You can also write about something that work that other people have done, but the important point there is that's got to be kind of part of a wider review of a topic area or subject area. We wouldn't want people just repeating or describing what somebody else has published elsewhere. It has to be a broader piece of analysis looking at a particular theme or topic. But anyway, as I say, the full competition rules are on the website, on that link there, so please make a note of those, and if you have any questions you can also email us directly, and I'm happy to help anyone who's got a question that isn't answered there. So the how of the competition, how you decide on a topic, well, that's really a question that is best answered by yourself. If I give out any ideas now, it's likely that we'll have a number of entries on the same topic. But keep in mind that you can write about almost anything that you choose to. So the three articles I mentioned there: the population of rats in New York City, using probability distributions to plan a wedding, or analysing Google search data to see whether Christmas comes earlier each year. These are all articles that we've had submitted before. I think that the important thing is to make the article relevant to a wide audience. So have a look at what's going on out in the wider world. One thing that occurred to me just before I came on the call, actually, I was looking at it was a Guardian article by a data analyst who's downloaded all the information that Facebook and Google hold on him. And now if you were such inclined to share all that sort of information about yourself on a public stage, you could, say, take that data and analyze some of it and use that to tell a story about yourself. But you'd obviously want to make sure that there was, as I say, wider relevance there. So you'll want to be picking up on maybe some of the themes around privacy and data protection and security and that sort of thing. But really, as I say, it's up to you and to discuss, with friends and colleagues, and try and come up with an angle on a topic that is of wider interest, but which you can bring a sort of unique statistical perspective to. And so here's some other suggestions. Ask yourself what's the best way to demonstrate what statistics can do, and how it makes a difference. And I guess it's, if you're studying statistics, a way for you to explain to people, this is what I do, this is how I hope to make a contribution in later life, and this is what my studies are teaching me. And in keeping with the general sort of 3 areas that we focus on, significance, you might want to take a popular myth and try and explode that, and look at the data underlying it and look into more detail, and really hold that up to scrutiny. It could be a question that you've seen discussed in the media that you want to provide a perspective on, or you'll have some evidence to support a decision that needs to be made. An example, for instance, is in our upcoming issue. There at our RSS conference last year, there was a really great talk from Professor Peter Guttorp about the decision that the town of Bergen in Norway needs to make about how to protect itself from rising sea level. And it was looking at all the different uncertainties and how you as a decision maker might need to work through those, and how you can weight them and consider them. So that sort of thing would make for a really great article. My key advice, though, is make sure it's a topic you're interested in personally and professionally, because if you're not engaged in it and you're not passionate about it, I think that it's very hard to sell that in the writing. So do make sure you pick something that you're keen on. How we pick a winner, the process here. Just talk to you briefly about that. So we have a judging panel. We have a couple of members of the Significance editorial board and members of the YSS committee. So we look through and read each entry and debate, and that usually takes place in June. The things we're looking for are interesting, engaging, and easy to read articles. But it's, obviously it's got to be a strong story, and it's got to be sound statistics. The two need to work together, which is, it's not always easy, but we've had some really great examples over the years, and we know it's possible. So if you submit something to us, the usual review process at Significance is to work with authors to refine their articles over time. As this is a competition, we wouldn't go through that process with you. But we might, offer some advice prior to publication on tweaking certain things. But really, that it needs to be almost fully formed when you submit it. So I would recommend, if you are going to submit, make sure you share it with people that you work with, who could give you some feedback and advice to help get it as good as you can get it before you submit. So as I said, the finalists, we do the judging in June. The winner will be announced at the RSS Statistical Excellence Awards ceremony in July, and then if you're in the country and you're able to come along to the award ceremony, that's great. We can present you with your trophy then. But if not, hopefully we will get to see you in September time at the RSS conference, where you'll be able to present a paper on your article and receive your trophy. So. Anyway, that's my talk. Obviously, we'll have time for questions at the end of the presentations, but just leaves me to wish you best of luck in the competition. And as I say, if you have any questions, ask them at the end, or you can always email me directly, significance@rss.org.uk. Thank you.
We're going to move on now to a presentation from Robert Matthews, who is an award-winning journalist, a statistician, and a member of the Significance editorial board, as well as a visiting professor in the Department of Mathematics at Aston University. And he's going to give a presentation on how we can make stats writing more accessible.
So thank you for that, Katie. As she explained, I've spent several decades now writing for a living, and as a result, I'm very keen to pass on some tips to help those who probably new to the process, especially of writing for a general audience as opposed to a specialized audience. So I'm presuming you've got an idea for a subject now, and as Brian said, one of the wonderful things about statistics as a subject is that there is so much that you can write about. Topical issues, I mean, the ones that I'm writing about at the moment from a statistical point of view are things like the replication crisis, which is currently roiling the scientific community and the economics community, how we can rely on the evidence that is published in refereed journals. That is a major debate at the moment. Big data, a lot of concern about whether it's reliable, whether you really can just rummage around in large files of data and hope to make reliable inferences. Health is always a very good one that resonates with lots of people. There are, at any given time, a number of running stories about sources of risk in the environment. What's the evidence for it? Does it really stack up? Sport is another very rich field. And I'd also make a suggestion about writing about finance, which is for the last 10 years has been in some sort of predicament and is full of very interesting areas of statistics and probabilities. So you might want to have a rummage around what's being talked about now to see if you've got something interesting to say now. But my job here is to talk principally about, so you've decided on a subject, and now you've got the really hard thing about how you're going to get started. Now, this is something that, as a journalist, formerly on a daily newspaper, I was expected to write 3-4 stories a day, and so you don't have a lot of time to mess about thinking about how you're going to get started. And I know you've got about 2 months to put together about 2,500 words to meet the deadline, but you would be amazed how quickly that goes. So here's the thing about writing, and that is, yeah, we can agonize over it and try and perfect our writing style so it's something approaching Ernest Hemingway, but at the end of the day, it's a process, and it is amenable to being deconstructed in a way that will allow you to get on with it and hit the deadline, even though at the moment, as I say, it sounds a long way off. So I find when I'm talking to people who ask me for advice about how to write about a subject, or indeed to present about a subject, that a really helpful framework is to do the following. That is to write down these 5 letters. Write them down, not horizontally here so you can read them, but vertically, because that is ultimately what the readers respond to, what any reader will respond to. Now, obviously, it's not just a matter of it being true. It's about the 5 key elements that any really compelling story or indeed presentation will have if it's going to succeed in capturing and holding an audience's attention. So the first of these is topicality. There is a bit of flexibility here because of the nature of significance as a magazine. So we can go back a little bit in history. But ideally, for a magazine like Significance, we're looking for something that taps into an issue that people are currently talking about. And we, both I and Brian, have mentioned some of those already. The next thing is to include an element, aspects of what you want to write about, which will resonate with the audience that you're hoping to appeal to, that it makes them go, yeah, I've often thought that, or yeah, I've often wondered about whether that is true, or yeah, what is all that about? Better still, if you can make it useful, that you're making it resonate from the point of view of, yes, it's giving some insight into a problem that you're providing some insight into how to solve. But relevance is very important. Every journalist, before they write, set to fingers to keyboard, will put aside everything that they've learnt in the course of researching the article, and will do the most important thing that anybody who wants to succeed in the media has to be able to do, and that is to put themselves in the shoes of the potential reader. And it's something that gets easier with practice, but that's what you want to do. You've got to ask yourself, what would I want to know about this subject? Because that will help you hit the target audience. So having done that, every audience always wants to hear stuff they haven't heard a million times before. So look out for quirky facts, quirky, dare I say, statistics that bring whatever you're saying to life. Trouble. Journalists are notorious for being obsessed about trouble. You just have to switch on the news headlines on the hour to hear how they will scour the world for a lot of miserable things. Now, the reason for that, there are various explanations for that, but I think one of them is actually mentioned in Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, where he points out that humans are typically more interested in avoiding the downside of decisions than they're interested in sort of benefiting from the upside. We are probably evolutionarily selected to want to find out more about how to stay out of trouble. And so articles that address a specific challenge or problem that people face in life and offer evidence-based solutions, they typically attract very high readership. So I can recommend that as a theme to tap into. And finally, one of the problems with academic writing is that it tends to be shorn of all sort of humanity. There's very little attempt to make it resonate with people through quotes, anecdotes, observations, including those really brings a subject to life. So if you're writing about your research, talk about why you got into it, what you found particularly challenging about addressing the issues that the thing threw up. People particularly like hearing about when you got stuck and how you overcame that problem. People like humanized storylines, even on really academic things. So having got a basic idea of the contents, then you've got to consider how you're going to draw readers in. For a journalist, of course, this is a big challenge because you are one of several stories on a page and you want readers to read your story rather than those written by your colleague. And so we get very adept and spend a lot of time thinking about that opening few sentences. In fact, I would say pro rata, I spend more time fretting about getting that first paragraph sorted out than about anything else because it is crucial. So do give serious amounts of thought to how to draw a reader in. And a classic way to do this is to use some mental imagery that everyone can relate to. So, for example, suppose that you're writing about, as I wrote some years ago for New Scientist magazine, about the theory, about queuing theory, okay, and about, as some of you may know, if you've studied it, it has some very interesting mathematical properties that mean that it's rife with non-linear effects, so that a small change in the amount of time that is spent serving people can make a huge difference to how long you have to wait, how long the queue becomes. But before you get into all those sort of technicalities, you want to create a mental image in the reader's mind to draw them in. So a nice little quote like that would, we've all been there stuck in the slowest queue, would work pretty well there. Or you can draw on a recent newsworthy example from real life of the issue that you're talking about. So, for example, if you were going to do a piece about the use of Bayesian search methods for tracking down the wreckage of aircraft that have gone missing, then you wouldn't want to start with a discussion of how Bayes' theorem works. You need to motivate people first by sucking them in with a line, something along those lines. Killer facts also work really well. So if you did take out the suggestion to write about finance, then the fact that 85% of Wall Street's finest actually do worse when picking their investment ideas than you would by holding up the Wall Street Journal's lists of equities to the wall and throwing darts at it. Warren Buffett recently concluded a 10-year bet with a Wall Street financier who was allowed to pick 5 different funds, which included a lot of hedge fund managers and things like that. You know, these people are supposed to know what they're doing, and Warren Buffett had a bet that none of them would do as well as his selection, which was simply to put money into the S&P 500, just into the American stock market, and just let it rise as the stock market rose. In other words, to not put any skill in at all. And you can probably guess how that bet worked out. Warren Buffett cleaned up yet again. So killer facts, killer anecdotes, always very popular. So once you've drawn them in, then you need to keep their attention. And the way to do that is through stories. There's been a very interesting BBC TV series on BBC 4 recently about how we ended up with Greek drama as an attempt to get the ancient Greek, the ordinary people, hoi polloi, to engage with political issues. And that's how we ended up with so many of those wonderful Greek dramas, because all humans can appreciate and resonate with stories. They work really well. Analogies are also a very useful technique to draw on. Unfortunately, statistics, probability is a very mathematical subject, profoundly mathematical, and so we can easily lose people if we just throw huge numbers at them or complex ideas at them. But by drawing analogies, this can really work. So, for example, the probability of winning the national lottery is a matter of picking 6 balls from 49, which doesn't sound that difficult until you do the combinatorics, and then you find out that it's hugely difficult. 14 million to 1, roughly speaking. Actually, I think it's gone up from there now. But if you re-express it in terms of an analogy to say that winning the lottery, getting the one winning lottery ticket is equivalent to pulling out that one black sugar grain hidden in a 12-kilogram bag of the stuff, suddenly people can visualize just how hopeless it is as a challenge. Whenever we're writing about subjects in statistics and probability, there is always a tendency, if we're not used to writing for a general audience, of slipping into jargon. Some people say don't use any jargon at all. In fact, a little bit of jargon is okay, as long as it's kept under control, because it gives the reader a sense of being drawn into a world about which they know very little. And, after a while, they might be able to brag to their friends, having read your article, about, for example, they know what a normal distribution is or a kosher distribution or something along those lines. So a little bit is okay, but you need to keep it to a minimum. And once you've put it in, you always need to explain it. Sometimes the concepts involved are quite complex, in which case consider putting the whole explanation, like of a theorem or of a way of putting a bound on probabilities, like Chebyshev's inequality, something like that. Consider putting it into a box so it doesn't break up that most important thing in any piece of writing, which is the narrative line. It's that golden thread that leads the reader from the intro that you've given them all the way through to the end, the fewer distractions that are thrown into the article itself that breaks them off that line, the better. So consider putting it into a box, and do keep mathematical stuff to a minimum, and definitely put that into a box, because for whatever reasons, it scares readers, even ones who are quite comfortable with maths. As soon as they see it, something happens to their brain, and again, you risk getting them to let go of the golden line of your narrative logic, leading them through the story. So keeping it readable is crucial, and in terms of style, there is again, a habit that one acquires when writing academic material to use the wrong type of language, the wrong type of structure. So it's always better, for these type of popular level articles, to put things like "we decided to investigate further," which is in the active mode, rather than "it was decided to investigate further," which is what's called the passive voice. If there's one simple rule that I would give anybody who wants to improve their writing style, it is simply to use very short words and colloquial language. So, for example, if you were talking about the nature of the data set you were trying to make an inference out of, it's much better to say parts of this data set were pretty noisy, rather than there was evidence of considerable heteroskedasticity. Hard enough to say, let alone write. Because as soon as the eye sees large phrases like that, technical jargon like that, it breaks the concentration, breaks the flow up. So having got your story down, you're pressing the word count button, and you're getting quite close to the limit now. You're going to have to start thinking about how to wrap up. Always a bit of a challenge to end nicely rather than with a screech of the brakes. A classic way of ending features, and you will see this done a lot in magazines like New Scientist, for example, is what's called the loop back, which is where you loop back to wherever you started the story. So, for example, to go back to that potential feature on queuing theory, you would loop back to that image of people queuing up at the supermarket and saying, so the next time you find yourself, being beaten by the queue next to you, you can bear it. Now you know why that is. It's because there's only a 1 in 3 chance of you being in the queue that beats both of your neighbouring queues. Nice little loop back. There's a nice sense of closure and symmetry to that. Similarly, what happened to Malaysian Airlines Flight 370 may never be known, but, and then you can explain how, for example, new search techniques may one day find it, if they can raise the funds to do it. The second standard technique is a look forward or a call to action. So this is where you have talked about your research project, and you look forward a little bit to what you're planning to do next and what your aspirations are. Or you can say, in the light of what's been discussed in the article, you can say, well, so how can we cut through this problem? Where do the solutions possibly lie? What should the next steps be? And again, that provides a nice way to finish the piece. And finally, while you're casting around for things to write about, do read sort of popular level magazines like New Scientist, BBC Focus magazine, and see what articles you like, and more importantly, why you like them. What was in it that you thought, yeah, that was really good? Because that is the best way. Learning through example is the best way of improving your own style. But at the end of the day, do create your own style if at all possible. So That's pretty much it. If you have got questions, do get in touch. I'm available on that email, rajm@physics.org, and I'm more than happy to answer questions if you have them. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Robert, for a very interesting presentation there and for drawing on your experience for us to provide some really useful tips. So I'll now hand over to Jonathan Auerbach, who is a PhD student in the Statistics Department at Columbia University. And he won our 2014 writing competition for his article entitled, "Does New York City Really Have as Many Rats as People?" And I'll hand over to Jonathan to tell us a bit more about it.
Thanks, Katie. I'm excited to talk to you guys today about my experience entering the writing competition, which I did in 2014. So again, my name is Jonathan Auerbach, and my entry was on estimating the size of New York City's rat population. So prior to my piece, many people in New York City believed that there were 8 million rats in the city. So I think a lot of people recognize this estimate had little basis in reality. The media and various government workers cited it frequently to convey the urgency of the city's rodent problem. So my entry used a public data set of service requests, which are basically complaints from residents, to argue that the true population of rats was much smaller than 8 million. I motivated the classic capture-recapture method for population estimation taught in many introductory statistics classes, and I demonstrated how a few reasonable assumptions could be used to make the problem of estimating the city's rat population tractable. So first I'll talk a little bit about how I wrote the article. The idea actually originated from a project I'd worked on a few months earlier evaluating New York City's open data law for a hearing with the city's legislature. As part of the evaluation, I worked with advocates to gauge whether the data released by agencies actually addressed the concerns of the city's communities. Among health code violations, rats were identified as a top concern. For a variety of reasons, agencies are extremely reluctant to document and share much of their data. Most meaningful insight into many government operations comes from the service request data. The problem with this data, though, is that residents complain for a variety of reasons, and the relationship between community need and service requests is confounded by an array of social, economic, and demographic factors. So when I heard about the competition, I wanted to use the service request data to write about sampling bias and highlight the problems with using these requests to evaluate agency performance. And I had a working title. It was something like, when a citizen calls, how should we answer? And myth busting or anything like it wasn't even on my radar. And in choosing a topic, I settled on rats only because they had been identified as a top concern, but also because they weren't politically sensitive, say as other service delivery topics like crime or education. And the original plan was to compare the service request data to data from surveys and inspections by the Department of Health to demonstrate the service request bias. But I quickly realized that all of these data sets that were available were unrepresentative of the same problem in one way or another. And it occurred to me that just estimating the population of rats was itself non-trivial and interesting. I picked capture-recapture and stratification because I felt those tools were simple enough to explain to an audience of laypeople. And then the myth-busting approach kind of fell out when I had done my research and realized that there was already this existing theory of the rat population. So at the time I was submitting my entry, I remember questioning the topic choice, and I had asked a few colleagues what they thought, and I think a few family members too, and the reaction was mixed, but actually on the negative side. So someone asked me, well, what did the previous winner write about? And I said, well, weddings. And then they said, well, why would anyone want to read about rats when they could read about weddings? I'll also mention that the statistics was very simple, but the entry required a fair amount of data manipulation. And I used several different shapefiles to reconcile the article's disparate data sources. And I also did some research. I wrote a book on rats by the journalist Robert Sullivan, which is an excellent book. It's called Rats. And I also spoke with members of the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, and the department was extremely helpful. I don't know if they would have been had they realized maybe how widely the article would end up being circulated. So the presentation was, I think, so I submitted, and maybe a month later I was invited to present the entry at the at a session at the Royal Statistical Society's International Conference, which was that year, I think, in Sheffield. And my presentation was pretty straightforward. I mostly ran through the visualizations I had made for the paper. One of the positive aspects was that I was able to go into more depth. And so while writing the article, I was constantly worried about losing the reader. And I tried to make sure each paragraph logically followed from the previous one. And I ended up defaulting generally to the simplest motivation I could think of, which limited the things I could write about. But in the presentation, I was able to motivate several and more complicated ideas. I was able to talk about the importance of accurate figures in policymaking and the role of statistics and open data in promoting transparency and accountability. So I'm just I guess I'll talk briefly about the response and then wrap up. So after the article was published in Significance, I think around October, first someone almost immediately contacted me from the Brian Lehrer Show, which is a local talk show in New York City. And they had set Google alerts on various New York City topics. And so they invited me to talk about the article on the show. And that was a really great experience because the staff and the interviewer had a lot of policy expertise. And they asked very interesting questions about the findings that I hadn't even considered, which led to, I think, a lot of mumbling on on the recording. But anyway, we talked about the role of statistics in government and open data, government transparency and accountability, very, very generally. And then I didn't hear anything for about a week or two. And then the LA Times emailed me about writing a story. And then after that story broke, I got flooded with emails. So I did an interview on NPR's All Things Considered. I spoke with journalists from the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Huffington Post, and a bunch of others I don't remember. And those 2 weeks were pretty chaotic, the following 2 weeks. But I think overall it was a lot of fun. And I had previous jobs where I worked with the press before when I worked for the New York City's legislature. But working with the press in this capacity, I was very shocked by the diversity of statistical competence. So I would say some journalists were incredibly professional and knowledgeable, while others were remarkably ignorant of basic mathematical concepts. And what kind of shocked me was that it wasn't the media outlets that I would expect. And I got the sense that as time went on, journalists were under pressure to add their own angle in order to differentiate their reporting. And so more than a few tried to come to me with a complicated angle beyond a simple story of data used to challenge myth, and were frustrated when I couldn't comment in the way they were looking for. And but since the article, since I wrote my article, I haven't seen the 8 million number quoted. So I'd like to feel I had some sort of an impact. And I'll just briefly conclude with, I just wrote down some lessons that I feel like I learned that maybe will be helpful for everyone else. So the first one was when I started, I cast a wide net. I considered multiple problems and topics that were kind of closely linked together, and then till I got a feel of what I thought would make a good article. The second I wrote down was I tried multiple angles, and I was kind of shocked with, and I talked to people about it, and I was kind of shocked at what they found interesting. And I found the more I knew the subject, actually the less likely the angle I found interesting was actually interesting to other people. And then the last two, so the third thing I wrote down was that I found it very valuable to reach out to experts that were extremely helpful and were able to point me towards other sources or things I should be reading. And the last thing that I learned the hard way is that transit in Britain is really expensive, and I booked all my tickets last minute, which was a very bad idea. So I guess that's all I have. Thanks for listening.
Thanks very much, Jonathan, for a really interesting presentation and for sharing your experiences with us. We'll move on now to the final presentation from Sam Tyner. So Sam is currently a postdoctoral research associate with the Centre for Statistics and Applications in Forensic Evidence at ISU. And Sam was a finalist in the 2015 Significance writing competition with her article on the joy of clustering. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Sam to tell us a bit more about her experiences.
Okay, thanks very much, Katie. Thank you, first of all, to Katie and Brian for hosting this, and thank you to Brian for asking me to participate. I was really excited to share my experience. So first, I just have a little about me. That's a picture at my graduation last semester with my advisor, and you can see my website. And I can also be found on Twitter, GitHub, LinkedIn, all those things at SCTYNER. And most of that was in my bio, so I'll go ahead and skip that for time. So this was my article that I had published online on Significance. It's called The Joy of Clustering. As you can see, it's about the show The Joy of Painting and the painter Bob Ross. So when Brian asked me to participate in this webinar, he had some questions for me, such as, how did you come up with the idea for the article? Can you offer some advice and guidance to the prospective entrants? And how did you craft an article that presents an accessible and engaging discussion and explanation of statistical ideas and methods? So I'll go through each one of these three questions. So my idea came from a class that I was in at the time. So that was Stat 503 at Iowa State University, taught by Di Cook, who is now a professor at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. And the title of this course is Exploratory Methods in Visual Data Mining. And the comic, I'm not sure if you can see that, but it's about Calvin and Hobbes, and I don't know which one is Calvin and which one is Hobbes. Sorry about that. But the kid says, I love messing with data. And so I also love messing with data, so that's why I took this course. And we had a class project at the end, and that was the big culmination of the class. And then Di encouraged me to publish it somewhere. And that's how I ended up publishing it or entering it into the YSS competition with Significance. So to get the idea for this project, as you may know, if you've ever tried to come up with examples for teaching or giving tutorials and things like that, you probably already know that getting data is the hardest part of any project like this. So I just did something fairly straightforward, and I started looking for data sources. I found 538's data repository on GitHub, and I put the website for that there if you're interested. And I stumbled across this data set called Bob Ross, and I was kind of like, Bob Ross, okay, I know that's the painting guy from the TV show that I used to watch when I was a kid. And so I clicked on it, and I found this article by Walt Hickey, which is a statistical analysis of the work of Bob Ross. So I read through that, and he, in his article, described his methods. He watched every episode of the show, and he hand-coded the paintings. So how many trees, how many mountains, how many lakes were there, was there a cabin or not, things like that. And so I read that. I thought it was cool, but I also thought there's got to be a faster way to do this. So what I did was I downloaded images of Bob Ross paintings from the web, turned them into data in R, and I clustered them using k-means. So the next thing Brian asked is how to make it accessible and engaging. So I think it's accessible and engaging because many people in the US are familiar with this show, The Joy of Painting. It was on public television for many, many years. I used to come home after school and watch it on PBS. So this show called The Joy of Painting, all episodes are now on Netflix in the US. If you're in the US, I don't know about Netflix in the UK. But people can imagine watching literally hundreds of episodes of a show and hand coding and entering all that data. And they can imagine the time and the effort that would take. So they can see the advantage of a sped up process like the one I had done. And then finally, to be accessible or to be engaging, you should tell a story. So I say two kind of contradictory things here. I say tell a story, and then I say show, don't tell. Well, first, tell a story. Make sure there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. So now that I've just said tell a story, I also am going to say show, don't tell. So don't just tell people you've done something unique and interesting. Show them that what you've done is unique and interesting. Next, I was asked about explaining statistical concepts. So I got kind of lucky because clustering is fairly intuitive. People can kind of understand it. I've shown this picture here that I just pulled from the web of an example of clustering. We're clustering people by it looks like their occupation, perhaps. So people can understand this concept, and it's important for this type of writing to find something that people can relate to on their terms. So find an analogy or example that people are familiar with, even if they're not familiar with the statistical idea that you're talking about. So this comic, you can see it's an XKCD comic. It's called The Upgoer 5. And so I put this here because I recently attended a workshop on scientific writing, and the presenter put up this comic, and I just thought it was just the greatest thing in the world. So it's about using appropriate language and avoiding jargon, similar to what Robert said earlier. So this is a diagram of a rocket explained using only the 1,000 most commonly used words in the English language. So it's obviously a little bit of hyperbole, and it's meant to be funny because it's a comic, but it's a good reminder to stick to appropriate language that people use every day, can understand, things like that. Finally, I just wanted to conclude by saying, think about what you think is interesting, write something that you want to write about. If you're not interested in it, it's not going to get done, it's not going to be interesting, it's not going to be engaging. So tell a complete story from start to finish and avoid jargon, and most importantly, have fun. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sam, for that really interesting insight into your competition experience. And thanks again to all of our presenters for taking the time to share their experiences with us. And a question I think really for Robert and or Brian, who've got the longer careers to draw on, but I wondered whether or not you've seen any changes in what's required in statistical writing over the years, particularly given the rise of big data and perhaps more public interest in data and statistics than there used to be.
Well, really, I just see an increasing recognition that data actually matters. So I think there's never been a better time to be knowledgeable and competent in the areas of data analysis because of the massive interest that there is in it. At the same time, I think there's also increasing recognition, not before time, that we live in an incredibly uncertain world, and that we and that there are a basket of techniques for dealing with this, and we call them collectively probability theory and the applications thereof, like decision theory. I wrote a book a couple of years ago called Chancing It, which basically tried to bring some of these techniques to a wider audience. So I don't think there's ever been a better time to get into the field of statistics-related journalism. So people taking part in this competition, it could be the start of a very good career for you.
I don't have much to add to what Robert said, really. I mean, certainly the importance and relevance of data has increased it in the length of my career, which is sort of funny. I've only been a journalist for 12 to 15 years, and certainly when I got into journalism, or the reason I wanted to get into journalism was because I was better at writing than I was with numbers, so I thought that I wouldn't have to deal with numbers too much if I was a journalist. But I don't know how I ended up editing a statistics magazine in that case, but it's certainly it's a skill that people need to have now, and being able to explain numbers and be confident with numbers and to have a conversation around them is crucial. And I think statisticians through this competition and other channels have a real role to play in helping the public get up to speed with statistical ideas and be conversant in data.
Yep. Thanks very much for that, both. We do have a question that's come in asking whether it's useful to include good pictures or graphs or diagrams with articles or other forms of data visualization, or are the articles judged solely on the writing? I assume that's intended to mean specifically for the significance writing competition, but I'm sure people might have comments on that more broadly as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can certainly from a judging perspective, it's a whole package, right? So if you're going to present graphs and figures, we're going to want them to be presented simply, neatly, and clearly. They don't have to be all singing, all dancing, interactive visualizations of the kind of which we see online a fair bit now. but we do expect them to support the story and show what you want them to show. And in fact, one of our judges writes our column on data visualization, so he might be particularly hot on that if your graphics aren't up to scratch. But both, I would encourage you both to look at Jonathan and Sam's articles, because they were both quite visual, and they used visuals in a really interesting way to emphasize and tell the story that they wanted to tell.
More widely, for those who enjoy taking part in this competition and think about working, offering articles to magazines more generally, you don't have to worry too much about providing images. If you can just sketch something out, they will be redrawn for you. They're most interested in the most difficult thing that needs to be supplied with the readable words.
Yeah. And we offer. I mean, we can do that as well. We don't have the an in-house design team, data design team to work on articles. But if your submissions come and you provide your supporting graphics in a editable format like an SVG file or an EPS file or an editable PDF, our designers can work with you to clean it up a little bit, so it doesn't need to be the finished version that you submit. We can work with you there if we've got the opportunity to do so through an editable graphic format.
Thanks again to the presenters, and also just to remind people that the closing date for the competition is 2 months today, so easy to remember, the 28th of May 2018. I'm sure if people do have any further questions when they think about it more, that the people at Significance will be more than happy to answer that if you get in touch with people.
I've just added my email to the chat window, so if people want to ask questions offline, they can do that.